All right, well, now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Alex Rajewski. He's going to come up and tell us how plants evolved. Alex has been an extension master since 2011 when he went through training in Iowa. He kept his certification when he moved to Kansas, then Georgia, finally here in California. He has a master's degree in horticulture from the University of Georgia. And in 2020, he completed his PhD in plant evolution from UC Riverside. Now Alex has an overflowing collection of container plants and has been collecting more and more species of voodoo lilies, corpse flowers, and we have some of those today for our raffle. Okay, Alex, thanks. Okay.
Okay. I've got this though.
Oh, we got.
Oh, we.
You don't need that one.
I don't know how to turn it off either. Should this advance my slides? Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. So thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm going to try to stay on my mark here. Feel free to interrupt me with any and all questions that you might have. The talk itself is fairly short, I think. But yeah, if anything piques your interest, feel free to just raise your hand. We can have a discussion about whatever. I think the newsletter said I was going to talk about corpse flowers and voodoo lilies. I can, but my presentation itself is actually all about how fruits evolved, although I do know quite a bit about corpse flowers and voodoo lilies if you're curious. So Jeff gave quite a good introduction of me, but just in case any of you are curious, I've sort of been all over the country doing various garden related things. I've been in California for about 7 years, I think. So still getting used to growing things here, lived in a lot of apartments, so don't have as many rare fruits in my garden as I would like. So currently I work as a geneticist for a startup, so not really in the plant world anymore, but still quite a bit of knowledge. So the first thing I wanted to start with is what is a fruit? I mean, if we're going to be talking about fruits for the next while, what are some things that come to your mind when you think of a fruit? Seeds, yeah. Okay, that's sweet. Yeah, colorful. So a lot of the informal definitions we talk about for fruits are things like sweet, colorful, juicy, that they have seeds. Some of them can be very expensive. If you think about like a cherry moya, for instance, or a durian or something like that. And these are sort of a more informal or culinary definition of fruit. So when you ask most people that aren't rare fruit growers or aren't master gardeners what a fruit is, you sort of get a lot of these things. And they're not necessarily wrong, but if you ask a botanist or a scientist, really there's only two things. It has seeds, or it has the capability to make seeds, and it comes from a flower. And if you want a more formal definition, I looked in one of my old textbooks, and it is strictly the pericarp and its seeds, the fertilized and developed ovary. And there's other definitions about whether the things are connected to the ovary or they're actually part of the ovary. Botanists like to argue about this kind of stuff in journals for hundreds and hundreds of years, but that's sort of the general definition. And there's this really intimate connection between a flower and a fruit. And I think a lot of you probably already know it, but I want to make it a little bit more pointed. Oh, hey, I got a pointer. So a lot of the terms here, like ovules and seeds, ovary, fruit, seeds and ovules, they appear on here twice. And that's because these things are related from the developing flower to the developing fruit. So the seeds themselves in the fruit are ovules in the flower. And at the point that the pollen comes down this style and fertilizes one of the egg cells in this ovule, that's when we have a transition from it being a flower to it being a fruit. And so there are a lot of similarities in structure. And if you start to dissect a lot of fruits, you'll start to see a lot of similarities from the morphology in the flower to the morphology in the developed fruit. And so this is a tomato. It's really easy if you can get like a loop out and dissect a tomato flower. You can see sort of a sort of baby tomato structure in it. And this is true for a lot of other nightshade fruits. If you can get them as a flower and dissect them, you can really easily see what the fruit's going to look like. Yeah. Yeah, you mean that they like that the structure looks pretty similar between the flower and yeah, and when you look at a cucumber, for instance, they have male and female flowers. You can sort of see the enormous ovary at the base of a female flower, and if you cut it open, they're not seeds yet, but you can see the ovules in there, and you can see the 4-part structure or 5-part. You can see the different sections, the different chambers of the ovary in there, and it's really kind of interesting because you'll get these very different looking mature fruits. Like in the nightshade family, for instance, you can get like a tomato or like a petunia capsule or a bell pepper. And when you look at them as a developing ovary, they all look almost indistinguishable. So yeah, the morphology sort of gets changed a little bit, it gets elaborated on, but back when it's a little ovary, it looks pretty similar. So I've got a quiz. I'm gonna show you a couple of different plant parts, and I'd like you to tell me, based on the knowledge you now have, if it's a fruit or not. It depends. Yeah, so that's a good point. So, and this is one this is one that you have to sort of clarify. There is not really a botanical definition, a scientific definition for vegetable. It's sort of a catch-all informal term. So we have a very formal definition for what a fruit is and what makes a fruit. And when we're cooking, there's lots of other things that we call vegetables, and they're just sort of other plant parts. And so there's a couple vegetables in the next few slides, and as we get to them, I can tell you like what actually each one is. So with the blueberry, I mean, the name kind of says it, but fruit, yeah. Fruit, I think we would all agree a peach is a fruit, or a nectarine, I can't really tell. Cantaloupe, yeah, fruit, we can even see the seeds in there. Not a fruit. So in this case, it's a bunch of leaves. They're all tightly compressed in the center of the head, but they're all leaves. At some point, this plant might make a flower and make a fruit, but the part that we eat is not at all a fruit. Every time I gave this presentation at the fair and I called them kiwis then too. I know this is an avocado. Also a fruit, you can see the seed right in the center there. Pumpkins, fruit. I think this is a great example of something that a lot of people would culinarily call a vegetable. Most people don't think of a pumpkin as something you would eat like you eat most fruits. And so if you're cooking with it, you probably cook with it like you cook with other vegetables. But it has seeds. If you ever carved a pumpkin, it's very clearly a fruit from our definition. Green beans. Also a fruit. Yeah, the actual peas that come out of it, those are the seeds, but the pod here is the entire fruit. If you ever dissect a flower for any sort of bean, you can see the really long ovary at the end of the flower. It's hidden behind some different petals, but you can dig it out. Zucchini, also a fruit. Yeah, it's hard to see sometimes, but there are the little seeds in there. We'll get to some more interesting cases of things that don't make seeds, but could, like a banana, for instance, or certain watermelons. We'll talk about those sort of at the end of the presentation as a catch-all grab bag category. Tomatoes, I already gave that one away. So, like I said, there's a lot of things that are maybe culinary vegetables, but botanical fruits. And so we touched on a lot of them, but some of the weirder ones are corn. Each corn kernel is an individual fruit. It's a dry fruit with a sort of a coating and then a seed on the inside. Rice, also a fruit. The part of rice that we eat is mostly the endosperm, but the entire rice that you would harvest from the plant is also a fruit. And then pepper, black pepper. We're eating a dried, ground up peppercorn, which is just a pepper fruit. So there's lots of examples of this where if you really drill into the botanical definition, it's very different from what most people would say. So we often do this presentation, a similar presentation, but different for kids. And we can tell them like, okay, now you can go home and tell your mom that pepper is a fruit and rice is a fruit, and she's gonna think you're crazy and what did you learn here? But it's all botanically true. And an important distinction a lot of people miss is that not every plant makes a fruit. So some plants are capable of making fruits and they just haven't yet. So for instance, the cabbage that we were looking at earlier, it can make a fruit, but not every plant is capable of making a fruit. So if we think about all plants, we can divide them up into a bunch of different categories. And one of the first questions you can ask is, does the plant have stems? And if the answer is no, you're probably looking at a moss or something like that, an algae, for instance. These are plants that are leafy, but they don't have any capacity to make like vascular tissue. They can't make xylem, they can't make phloem. That hasn't evolved for them. But if it does have a stem, then you have to ask if it has seeds. And earlier we said that all fruits have seeds, but not all seeds have fruits. So there's sort of a widgets and that kind of thing. So if it doesn't have seeds, but does have stems, you're looking at like a fern or something generally related to ferns. So ferns have spores, so they reproduce sexually, as do mosses, but they don't make seeds, they just sort of dump these spores. And spores are really nice because you can make a ton of them if you're a plant, and there's really not much cost to it. You can just dump spores into the air all day and you haven't really lost any sugar, not really. You haven't lost any water. It's not bad for you as a plant. So it's fairly easy. The downside is those spores aren't protected. They can dry out really easily. When they're starting to make a small plant, it's really easy to kill them. They need a lot of wet conditions. And so ferns generally live in pretty wet environments, and that's really limiting for them. It's really great if you have a wet environment, but once there start to be dry climates, it's not so useful. So if the plant does have seeds, then you can ask if it actually makes fruits. So a lot of things have seeds but don't make fruits. So a lot of the conifers, so pines, ginkgos, cycads, those are all seed plants. They make the typical kind of seed that you would see inside of a fruit, but that seed isn't protected by the fruit. And that's really the key innovation of the flowering plants, is they make these flowers have this ovary and it protects these seeds. It can do a lot of other things that we'll talk about in a second, but fruits are a really great evolutionary invention. So we didn't get from mosses, which make sort of free-floating sperm and egg, to flowering plants and strawberries in one jump. It was sort of an evolutionary progression. And at some point, there was a fruit, but it was the first fruit. And so what did that fruit look like? Now, the downside is that, yeah. Yeah, you're right. So yeah, so the question is, ginkgos look like they have fruits, but they don't. What is that thing that they make? So ginkgos make a seed, and that seed has sort of a fleshy layer on it. That's what smells like dog poop and vomit mostly. And that is a seed coat that's sort of swollen up. So there's not really an ovary that's protecting that seed. So if you're just looking at the seed when it's like on the tree, it looks very similar to a fruit. If you follow its development from the beginning of the flower, well, not a flower, the beginning of the reproductive structure to the final seed, you can tell that it doesn't have an ovary. There's nothing enclosing the seed. It's just a part of the seed that sort of puffs up and gets wet and slimy. So developmentally, you can tell the difference, but when you're looking at the final product, it looks very similar to a fruit. Like it looks a lot like a date fruit, for instance. But the difference is in how it develops and what the structure is that it comes from. Does that make sense? Maybe. Okay. So like we said, we didn't just jump from mosses to strawberries. We had some first fruit, and what did it look like? So it happened about 150 million years ago, give or take, depending on how you date the fossils. But it is right here is this flower bud in their picture. This, they think, is the developing fruit. And from the fossil records, it's from China. It's about a ½ inch long. It's oval. It's a dry fruit. We'll talk more about different kinds of fruits ad nauseum. I'm certain there'll be questions there. But based on this description, this 150 million-year-old fruit probably looked a lot like a sunflower seed. And a sunflower seed, this is actually a single fruit from a sunflower. The entire flower develops a bunch of fruits, but the sunflower seed, what we call the seed, is the entire fruit. The husk is actually the ovary that's sort of swollen up and dried out. It can split open. And then inside is the actual seed, the thing that we would actually eat. And like I said, the first fruits weren't fleshy. And so you know a lot of dry fruits. You're definitely familiar with dry fruits. Dry fruits are things like acorns or anise or these samaras here. This is a tobacco fruit, peanuts, sunflower seeds, dandelions, each one of the little things that floats away. That is a flower, the remnants of a flower and a little fruit at the bottom, little dry fruit. So dry fruits don't get a lot of press, and I feel really sad about that because my PhD studied dry fruits. So I think they're really cool. I think they're really innovative. I've got a lot of thoughts on dry fruits. But the thing about them is they're safe. So just like we saw with the ferns that make these spores, the spores just get scattered to the wind and they're really low investment. There's not a lot of water, there's not a lot of sugar involved in a spore. The same thing is true for a dry fruit. And it sort of splits the difference. Like you get some sort of protection for your seed, you've got some sort of seed coat, you've got some sort of fruit wall that's protecting the seed itself, but it doesn't take much energy. You're not dumping a bunch of sugar into a fruit. You're not feeding some animal and hoping that it will take your seeds somewhere. You're not losing any water, which is really important for a lot of these plants. So dry fruits give you a lot of protection for your seeds, but they're not a lot of investment from the parent plant. So they're really sort of evolutionarily conservative. You often see dry fruits in desert environments because you don't want to give a bunch of water and just dump it on the ground or give it to some animal if you're a plant. You want to keep that water for yourself. So if we think about a fleshy fruit, or if we think about a dry fruit like this tobacco seed pod here, how did we get from a dry seed pod like this tobacco fruit to something fleshy like a tomato? And I picked this example because these are actually both in the same family. They're only separated by like 20 million years of evolution. They're actually pretty close cousins. And you can see this progression if you go from a tobacco flower or a tomato flower all the way through the fruit maturity process. Dry fruits will start off sort of wet if you cut them open, and then eventually they'll dry down. In the case of tobacco, instead of ripening, it dries out and it splits open at these different dehiscence zones, they're called. Whereas tomato looks very similar until a little bit after the flower petals fall off, and then the ovary starts to swell up really quickly. And then instead of splitting open like a dry fruit does, it ripens. And it turns out that the evolutionary and biochemical pathways that let a plant split open and dry down are actually really similar, strangely, to the ones that let it ripen and soften. You've got a lot of the same things happening here. So you notice how a ripe tomato feels very soft to the touch. It's very squishy. It's not at all like an unripe tomato in terms of texture. The same sort of thing is happening with this dry fruit, where you've got the entire outer part of the fruit is this dry husk, and then it starts to split open. And the same thing that makes a fleshy tomato sort of soften is making these areas where it splits open also soften. And then as it dries out, those weak areas are where it splits open. So the pathways are really similar, even though at the end of the day, you get very different looking things. So the key thing is that the fleshy fruits lost this compound called lignin, which is what makes dry fruits dry and woody, and they got more cells. So if you take a cross section under a microscope and you color it by what sorts of things, what sorts of structures you're looking at. So blue is just the number of cells, and red is this lignin compound, this woody compound. You can see that the tomato has way more cells if you go from the outside on the right to the inside on the left compared to the tobacco. The tobacco has like 8-ish cell layers, depending on what species you're looking at, but there's only about 8 cells between the inside and the outside. Depending on the kind of tomato you're looking at, there's dozens to hundreds of cell layers. And then of course you can see by the red coloring, if any of you are red-green colorblind, I'm sorry, but in the bottom picture, there's sort of trapezoidal areas that are red, and those are the lignified areas. The tomato doesn't make any lignin. You've bitten into a tomato, you know that it's not woody. Please don't bite into a tobacco fruit, they're very disgusting. But you can tell immediately, there's no woody tissue in either one of the, in any tomato. And so you can see sort of the same thing in this cartoon. You can see the outside of the fruit on the right-hand side at both cases, the inside side of the fruit on the left-hand side, and there's way more layers of cells in a tomato, way fewer in a tobacco, and you can't see the lignin, but that's one of the main differences. So the jump from no fruits to fruits is slow, but pretty easy. You get like a dry fruit that's kind of like a spore. It's not really advanced. And then the jump from a dry fruit to a fleshy fruit is really just changing a couple of things at the end, changing how it ripens, changing how it doesn't lose water, changing how it doesn't get woody. So the jumps are pretty quick. Yeah. So really the only difference between a dry fruit and a fleshy fruit is what happens in the outer wall of the fruit. So that's the key difference when you're looking at the two different kinds. And oh, okay. So the question is, what about fruits that have the seeds on the outside, like a strawberry? Strawberries are a strange case. So the thing that you would call a strawberry seed, that's actually botanically the fruit. Like it's sort of similar to a sunflower seed. Like you could split it open and you would see a seed on the inside. And what you're looking at is the dry fruit. The red part of a strawberry is actually the sort of base of the flower that swells up. So it's similar to an apple. An apple is also, the part of the apple you bite into is actually just a swollen part of the flower base. So when you think about a strawberry, the actual fruit is a dry fruit. But then when we eat a strawberry, the thing we're eating is a bunch of fruits together and then also some old flower parts. But to get back to your question about what the point of this whole cell wall, like outer part of the fruit is, the idea is that there aren't a lot of differences between dry and fleshy fruits. It's really just a couple of quick changes on the outside of the fruit. Like how many cells does it make? A lot or a little? Do those cells dry out and stay woody, or do they get big and stay fleshy? So the change is pretty small. Does that make a little bit more sense? No, I mean, the line between dry and fleshy is really obvious when you look at like a tobacco fruit and a tomato fruit. But when you get to something like a chili pepper, something like is probably technically fleshy, but when you eat it, chili peppers mostly they're dried out, like especially like a Thai chili that you would dice up. The line is sort of blurry. So this is a really extreme example to sort of show how the fruits can change and you can manipulate really small things and get a very drastic change in the fruit. But the dividing line between dry and fleshy is sort of blurry. Any other questions? So there are many, many other kinds of fruits. I have some botany textbooks if you want to peruse them later. But among the fleshy fruits, there are mostly the kinds you hear about are berries. So things like tomatoes or blueberries, those are true berries. And then there's drupes. Drupes are stone fruits. So peaches or things with a very hard, they usually have a very fleshy outside. And then usually there's one seed. And usually that seed has a really stony, woody sort of covering around it. And then we mentioned an apple. So an apple is a type of fruit called a pome. You can sort of see the dotted line on there. The stuff inside the dotted line, that's the fleshy part of the fruit. The stuff outside is that swollen part of the flower that we talked about. So an apple is sort of a weird case. And then we have things like aggregate fruits or multiple fruits, things like pineapples or mulberries or raspberries, things that are really collections of a bunch of fruits that like we eat together, sort of like your strawberry. Those are examples where the fruit that we eat is actually a bunch of different fruits that are stuck together at different points in development. And then dry fruits, again, I think they're super cool. They basically come in two types, and it's whether they split open, like a legume, or like a poppy fruit. If you've ever seen a poppy fruit, they have like sort of a vase shape and a bunch of holes at the top, and you can shake the seeds out of those holes. So those holes form by the fruit splitting open. And so a lot of dry fruits will split open to release their seeds, but some won't. So fruits that don't split open are called achenes. Those are things like sunflower seeds or the actual fruit of a strawberry. And then there's things like nuts or samaras, like a maple leaf, a magnolia fruit. If you've ever seen what happens after a magnolia flowers, it has a bunch of those little red seeds that pop out. But the things that they sort of get squeezed out of are little follicles. They're a type of dry fruit that splits open, and then the seed pops out. But that's another kind of dry fruit that splits open. And then there's all kinds of other ones in there too. No, not gonna advance. You change the focus. Perfect. So there's many other kind of types. If you're curious, I'm happy to talk about them, but berry is sort of a catch-all category. If you've heard of a fruit called a peepo, it's the fruit that the the gourd family makes, so things like a pumpkin or a zucchini. It's a kind of berry that generally has a thin, sort of hard outer part, and it's fused to all the other parts. Whereas a tomato, like, you can't really skin a tomato, but you could skin most gourds. That's sort of the difference. Hesperidium is another kind of berry. That's something like an orange or a banana, where you can like peel off the outside layer. Usually the outside layer has a bunch of oil glands, it's got a lot of smell to it, but there's a really strong separation between a peel and the inner part of the fruit. Oh, I lost focusing. Oh, no, I didn't. If you're reading a lot of botanical textbooks, there's another important fruit called a caryopsis. That's the kind of fruit that most grasses make. It's a dry fruit, it's pretty boring, but it's separate from most of these. And then you can split this aggregate category into aggregate versus multiple. I can talk about the difference if you want, but it's not that important. And then all the dry fruits, you can sort of classify them based on how they split apart, where the lines that they split apart are, how many there are, if they exist or not. There's different ways to classify fruits, dry fruits. So this is sort of toward the end of the talk, but the next thing I want to talk about is how humans have evolved fruits. So far everything we've talked about is over millions of years. We've got all these evolutionary pressures that are making a plant lose water or lose sugar or not, or be conservative or not. But then humans came onto the scene and we did a ton of stuff to change how fruits look. So I found this on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, how it's going versus how it started. So this is, I don't know if you've been familiar with a plant called teosinte. It's from Mexico. It's the ancestor of corn. And so the corn that we eat is like this dent corn here, but a couple thousand years ago, Mesoamericans got this and thought, oh, I can eat this. And after years and years and generations of selection and picking their favorites, they took teosinte from something that makes 8 seeds to something that makes hundreds and is the basis of most farming in the Midwest. And evolution can be really quick. So watermelon, for instance, is a type of fruit. It's a pepo. It's from Southern Africa. It's actually a desert plant. And we can track how watermelon has evolved in art. So if you look at still life paintings, which often will show a bunch of like really opulent fruit, and they'll usually have them dissected or partially eaten as if they're going to be on display, we can track how artists have shown us what the fruits they have all around them have been through the ages. So in the 17th century, we had this picture of a watermelon. And I don't know if you can see too closely, but the flesh is pretty pale. It's mostly white. It's got these swirls. It has a ton of seeds. The outer part of the watermelon has changed a bunch depending on tastes and who thinks what colors are cool or what new cool variety they can find. But the inside here has a lot of rind, and it's got these really swirly, sort of gross looking consistencies. So that's around 1650 or so, 17th century. A little bit later, we can see that the rind on the fruits is getting a little bit smaller. We don't have the like swirls of rind coming into the center of the fruit. It looks much more recognizable as what we would think of as a watermelon. And then in the 1830s, we can see that there are some varieties that all these really thick rinds. It's got essentially a core that you could probably pull out. So kind of a strange looking watermelon. And this is only 200 years ago. A little bit later, we've still got this very strong center of the watermelon, but the rind is getting thinner and thinner. It cracks a lot more easily. There's a lot less rind, a lot more red flesh, but a ton of seeds. A little bit later, we're getting much more ripe fruit. We're getting still a lot of seeds, but it's much deeper reds now, much more beautiful colors, probably a lot more vitamins. And now they've fully lost the seeds. And there's almost no rind to speak of. They're also about this big. So in the course of 300 years, you can see how watermelons have changed just because of what we want them to look like and what we think is cool, what we want to plant, what humans want to do with watermelon. So the idea behind this is a bunch of plant breeding. It is a $1 billion a year industry. And the idea behind it is that farmers will save the seeds that they like. So they'll plant some fruit, they'll eat the plants and say, oh, that variety was way better than the other one. I'm not going to save those seeds. I'll save the ones that were good. I'll save the ones that didn't fall over in the windstorm. I'll save the ones that had bigger fruits that were easier to harvest. And usually we tend to pick the same sorts of traits. We want bigger fruits with fewer seeds. We often want the taste to be better, although in the case of tomato, that sort of fell by the wayside. A lot of the tomatoes that we have that are the modern, really great ones, they taste like nothing. So it can often fall by the wayside. We often breed them to be non-toxic. So things like watermelons and tomatoes both make a lot of toxins, actually. If you eat tomato leaves, you're going to get sick. Watermelon also makes this chemical called cucurbitine, which is very toxic to most insects. And we breed watermelons to have less and less and less, and eventually none of that. And we do this with all kinds of plants. We also breed them for more consistent growth. And this is very popular with corn. So for instance, with corn, it's so precisely bred that varieties of corn will have different kinds of tractors, different brands of tractors that harvest them, because all the corn plants will grow to about 9 feet tall, and the ear of corn will be about this high off the ground, and there will be precisely one. And if you had an ear of corn that was here, the tractor couldn't harvest it. So it's very precise breeding, very precise timing of when the fruit's going to be ripe, how big the fruit's going to be. So we've done a lot of magic with corn breeding. Other things are like, we will breed a lot of trees to be smaller. So I know with apples, it's sort of dwarfing rootstocks and things like that. But generally, we breed trees to be harvestable within our reach, and we'll breed plants to have much more straight growth habits. They don't fall over, much easier for us to deal with because we're the ones that are doing the harvesting. So an example of this is like bananas. So if you look at this, probably a Cavendish banana, no seeds to speak of. I can talk about why that's the case if you care, but this is sort of what the ancestral banana looked like. This is a wild banana before any kind of breeding. It's mostly seeds. And if you're gonna eat this banana, you're gonna be spitting out a lot of seeds. There's not a lot of banana flesh. It's probably not even worth eating compared to what we're used to now. And this is all because of modern plant breeding. Tomato. So with bananas, they don't have seeds because we've bred them to be sort of like a mule. So we take two different kinds of bananas and we crossbreed them, and the two different kinds of bananas are so far apart that they make other banana plants like a Cavendish or a Gros Michel or whatever, but that plant can't make its own seeds. It's sterile. And so the way we propagate bananas or a lot of other plants like this is we'll either remake the mule, so to speak, every generation. We do that with watermelon, or we'll take cuttings. And so that way we can get around having to deal with all these seeds, but still get acres and acres of bananas or acres and acres of watermelons without seeds. I've never actually felt them. I don't know. I would imagine they're hard because I've heard stories about kids eating them and then having like a lot of stomach problems because it's just so many seeds. So tomato is another great example. The ancestral tomato is actually still around. It's a species called Pimpinellifolium, or currant tomato. It's perfectly edible. It doesn't taste anything phenomenal, but it's about the size of a pinky fingernail. And then compared to like a beefsteak tomato or something, the size is enormous. And that's because of really only a couple of changes that we've made to make the plant make more chambers in its ovary and get a little bit bigger. Rice is another great example of modern plant breeding. So here is a sort of a more natural variety of rice called Swarna. And there was some genetic engineering that we did back in the 70s, 80s, to put this other gene from a different species of rice in here. And essentially what we changed is that normally when a rice field is flooded, the rice plants try to grow above the water. And that's really great if the field's going to stay flooded. But if it's just a temporary flood, the rice plants grow, the water goes away, and the rice all falls over and gets tangled and gets lodged, and then you really can't harvest it. What these sub-1 plants do is once they're flooded, they just chill for like a couple weeks and they don't grow at all, which seems like a really bad strategy if the flood's going to stay. But because the farmers knew, oh, the flood's temporary, the floods are always temporary, they bred these plants and they just wait until the flood's over and they start growing again. And so this one change between Swarna and Swarna with the sub-1 gene that we added goes from a field that's essentially unharvestable. There's fully no rice in this field to a field that you can get a full harvest out of. Change the focus back, I think. Oh, great. Carrots are another great example. They're not a fruit, but it's an example of plant breeding. So this is sort of what an ancestral carrot looks like. It does have a kind of a taproot, but certainly nowhere near what we're used to now. Another interesting thing about carrots is that they're generally in the wild, they're white. But back several hundred years ago in the Netherlands, they thought it would be really fun to breed an orange carrot because the king's last name is Orange. And they were like, oh, wouldn't this be fun for like the 50-year anniversary? We'll make these orange carrots. It'll be so wild, so funny. They did it and people were like, oh, these are really good. And then it just sort of caught on. And now almost all the carrots are orange because of this one gimmick for a Dutch king. I sort of mentioned this earlier, but corn is another great example. The teosinte on the left is sort of the ancestral corn. It makes maybe 8 kernels of corn, and through a couple thousand years of just saving the ones that were better, getting rid of the ones that you didn't like, we get these really nice ears of corn. Another big change is that teosinte branches a bunch, and so it's often really hard to get like a big ear of corn if you're going to get 30 ears of corn in the same plant. And so by making it branch less, you get fewer fruits, but the fruits are bigger and they're also easier to harvest and they're more standard. I think my battery might have just died. So in summary, botanical fruits aren't always culinary fruits. We saw that with things like tomatoes or cucumbers or pumpkins. Not every plant can make a fruit, even though some of them are evolutionarily incapable. Some of them just we never let make a fruit. They're about 150 million years old. The first ones were dry, and plant breeding gave us a lot of really interesting things. I have other slides about some research mutations of fruits if you're curious, but we can sort of get to those in the questions if you have any. But yeah, other than that, that's the end of my talk.
Change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's happened over the years, just the manipulation of the DNA over time that has caused the fruit to go bigger. But now man is manipulating the DNA, and that's the genetic engineering, that are doing to modify the fruit. So, what we're doing is accelerating a natural process.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. So when we do a lot of the more modern plant breeding, it's very targeted. Like we know and I've got some slides about this later, but I think 3 or 4 years ago, some researchers took some tomato species and they knew from natural breeding of tomatoes that we've really only changed 5 or 6 genes. And those genes involve like how many chambers the fruit has, how many flowers it produces, and how many branches it makes. And they were like, well, we know where these genes are in this wild tomato species. Let's just modify those 3 genes. And so what they did is they took a fully wild tomato plant and in the lab, they domesticated it in 3 years. And so you went from having this really weedy sort of shrubby looking tomato to something it has enormous seeds still, but something that looks kind of edible. And so we've gone back and looked at a lot of the plants that we've domesticated and we have a pretty good idea of the genes that we've changed. Certainly not all of them. There are tens of thousands of genes in most plants. And we don't know everything we've changed. And that's sort of what you get with the tomatoes that we've bred that don't taste very good. We were selecting just for bigger and bigger and bigger tomatoes and not really paying any attention to the other things that were there as well.
I know that some plants you have to have, you'll have a male and a female on different plants, or you'll have plants that have to be fertilized by a different plant. But why would you have a plant like an avocado or a cherimoya where the same flower is male at one time and female at a different time? I don't understand.
Yeah, so the idea behind it or there's no idea. The plant evolved this fully by happenstance. They didn't plan anything. But the benefit of having a flower that can fertilize itself is that if you're the only, for instance, tomato in the county, and you flower and you can't pollinate yourself, or you can't fertilize yourself, that means you're not making any fruits, you're not making any seeds, and you're just gonna die. So being able to self-pollinate and self-fertilize is a really great backup. So it ensures that if you're a weed that's like the first plant in a new island or the first plant in a new area, that you've got some insurance policy. You're gonna have some seeds. They're gonna be kind of inbred. They're not gonna look great, but you're gonna have seeds. You'll live to another year. But you don't want that because inbreeding eventually will cause in plants similar problems that it causes in humans. And plants can tolerate inbreeding pretty well, actually, but eventually it's got its costs. And so most plants will have some sort of system where they'll try their best to get pollinated by another individual. But as sort of a backup, they'll have sort of a way to self-pollinate. And so that's the case with avocados, where if you have, for instance, one avocado, it might be male early and female late. Or this is the case with like mimosas, where you'll have all these anthers that pop up and it's male, and then eventually they'll shrivel and all the stigmas will pop up and it's female. So there's a very, very small chance that it could pollinate itself, or you'll get a couple of fruit. And those are sort of the backups. Like you really want to have some kind of outcrossing because you're going to get better kids if you're not inbreeding.
So I kind of wonder, I mean, like cauliflower, they now have them in purple and orange and different colors. Is that something that naturally, I mean, a lot of people pick it because it's pretty and stuff like that, but I avoid anything that's changed in color because I'm scared they're playing around with the genetics. So how do they go about changing the color instead of white, purple?
It really depends on the plant. So in most cases, for most plants that we can buy in the grocery store, there's some collection somewhere of a bunch of ancestors and wild varieties. And usually we're growing the same kind of cauliflower. Like the cauliflower you get in California is pretty much the same as what you're getting in Vermont or wherever. But when there's a new trend, you can go back to some variety collection or some germplasm bank, and you can find the weird ancestor that's purple. And then you can start breeding your modern cauliflower with the purple one and start getting cauliflower that's what people want in terms of how big it is and what it tastes like, and just has a little bit of purple color. So that's one way to do it. There are other ways. Certainly you could like add a gene, and the gene that makes the purple color is very easy to put in. I mean, you can make a plant glow green, and it's something that in the lab, it's a project we give to like sophomores and freshmen, is like hey, try your hand, make this plant glow green. It's very easy. If you actually want to sell that plant or actually want to grow it in a field, it's very legally difficult. There's decades of clearances through the FDA and the USDA to make sure that you didn't put in other genes, or you didn't put in some sort of antibiotic resistance gene or something like that, something that might have an adverse health effect. So generally speaking, most of the plants that you would find that have suddenly become purple are from some quick breeding activity that some breeder was like, oh, I guess I can make it purple with some heirloom variety that I have in my backyard. In some cases, there is some other gene that's been added in. Golden rice was an example of that back in the 80s. There was this problem in Asia where people would eat a lot of rice and they wouldn't get enough vitamin C, I think. And so the scientists were like, oh my God, we can, and it causes blindness. And the scientists were like, oh my gosh, we can solve all this blindness by just putting a gene for vitamin C into this rice. The rice turns bright gold because it's got so much vitamin C, or vitamin D maybe, some vitamin. And they finally got it through all these regulatory clearances, and the people that got it were like, oh, yellow rice, gross. And they were like, no, we'll keep on eating our same white rice. So there's really not that many plants that have been genetically modified for a color, just because that one was so unpopular. Everyone's sort of like, I'm not going to waste the money to do it. There's other ways to modify colors that are not legally, in the US at least, not legally a genetic modification. So one example is mint. Like a lot of the mint that we have was actually bred through a technique called radiation breeding, which is, it's fascinating. You essentially have an enormous field of mint, and you put a piece of radioactive thorium in the center. And then all the mint that's right close to it dies because it's got all this radiation poisoning. But the mint that's further out just gets kind of mutated. And of course, the mint at the edges gets no radiation and it looks fine. And then you remove the piece of thorium, and then you go in and look at all the mint that's kind of weird. And then you're like, well, that one looks interesting. And so you keep on growing that one. And so a lot of the mint that we have is bred that way. It's not radioactive anymore, it's just been mutated because of radiation. A lot of our citrus, they'll irradiate it with X-rays or gamma rays or something to like break the DNA and see what you get. And usually it's bad. And usually they don't do anything with it, but sometimes it'll make them seedless, sometimes it'll make a new color, sometimes it'll make them shorter, whatever. So that one, that will never be on a label because you can't prove it. But that's another way that's not technically a genetically modified plant, but is very, very clearly genetically modified.
One other thing, they're now coming out with watermelons with no seeds that you can plant. So how do they keep propagating if the fruits eventually are going to have no seeds?
That's the same sort of mule thing. So in a field for making seedless watermelon, you'll plant alternating rows. You'll have one that is going to make the fruits that you're going to harvest. And that will have some sort of number of chromosomes, say 12, for instance. And then right next to it, you'll plant another group of watermelon that has twice that number of chromosomes. And it makes a fruit that looks visually very different, like it's small and yellow, because you're not going to harvest those. And what you do is you let those two plants cross-pollinate. And in both cases, because the chromosome numbers are different, you're going to get something like a mule, some sort of fruit that's sterile. And so what you do is you harvest the fruits that look the way you want from the one row of plants that you liked. And then those are what you sell. And then the other ones you just throw away. Every year you have to do that, where you keep seeds from the parents and plant them out alternating rows and only harvest half of them. And so every year you have to keep on making those hybrids, sort of like the F1 hybrid corn that we get, or there's like petunias that are that way, where you get some hybrid that was made and they sell those seeds. And in some cases it makes seeds, in some cases it doesn't. In the case of the watermelon, there's no seeds, of course. But every year they have to keep on remaking those sort of mules.
So online they can hear too.
Would you have any background information on the olive tree? It's been in cultivation for thousands of years.
Mhm.
And was it at first edible, for example?
So I don't know offhand. So the question is about olive trees, and they've been in cultivation for thousands of years. Do I have any information about that? I don't know, but yeah, olive trees have been around probably about as long as humans have. And they're from an area where humans like really started farming intensely for the first times ever. So I imagine that olives are very intensely bred, sort of like a lot of the other plants we worked with, like corn or whatever. My sort of gut instinct is there's definitely no genetically modified olives that are out, at least not in the States. But I don't know of any sort of fun stories about how they were bred or anything like that. No, I'm sorry.
Well, you showed us a slide with the first fruit from the fossil record.
Mhm.
That was a dry fruit, right? Is there any evidence of the first fleshy fruits when they evolved? And I assume they evolved in conjunction with animals that are eating them and spreading them.
Yeah, so there probably is. The problem is that the dry tissues, they fossilize really well, but it's really hard. It's sort of like dinosaur skin. Like we don't really know what color a dinosaur was because that doesn't fossilize well. So I imagine there probably are some fossils. I know that at least and the other thing is that fleshy fruits have evolved a bunch of different times. And so I know that in the case of like tomatoes and the nightshade family, for instance, it's something like 80 million years old. So dry fruits weren't the only game in town for very long. Like fleshy popped up pretty quickly. But yeah, it generally coincides with some sort of animal that's gonna eat the fruit and spread it around. Because that's like the big advantage of making a fleshy fruit is you can like get an elephant to eat a watermelon and then move the seeds in its dung much further than the wind could. But I don't know exactly how old the first fleshy fruit was, though.
Okay. Well, the rice you showed us, the golden rice, or you mentioned the golden rice, but the rice you showed us in the field that didn't that went dormant for when it was covered in water. Was that a GMO type of rice? So that was an example of showing you some of genetic engineering and not a just crossbreeding.
Right. That one was an example of there was a big effort in the Philippines. There's a big rice breeding institute there called IRI, and they found a natural rice variety that had that gene that makes it sort of go dormant. And then they had a big breeding effort to get it into the modern varieties of rice we use. So that one is sort of a hybrid idea. It's sort of a gray area where you're taking a gene from rice and you're putting it in rice. So it's sort of normal breeding. It's not a GMO generally, but the process that we use to find that rice gene and to make sure it was in the new rice, that's all very molecular biology based. But theoretically, any farmer could have done it with a big enough field.
Did that require any special licensing to make it public because it was still done in a lab?
So I know that the scientists and the companies that were involved in it, after they bred it, they gave up the intellectual property because it was specifically designed for like poorer countries in Southeast Asia. And so they were like, well, we don't want to like make this plant and then charge you an arm and a leg. We want you to not starve. So that particular one, there aren't any sort of like legal hurdles about saving seeds or anything like that, but it did have to go through some sort of approval. And different countries have different approval processes. So it sort of depends on where you want to release it.
We get a lot of questions at the Master Gardener booth where we give away seeds to make sure the seeds we're not giving away are GMO seeds. And we always explain, well, we don't have access to GMO seeds to even give you. You require, only farmers can get those with licensing, et cetera. Are there many fruits now that we can buy that are genetically modified? And we know, lots of soybeans and corn are. I've read that papayas mostly are GMO papayas that we're buying. Is there anything else you know about?
Yeah, so almost every soybean that you buy in the United States, at least, I think like 96 or 95% of the soybeans are genetically modified, mostly to resist Roundup, but also some of them have other like insecticides that they make in the leaves. Almost all the corn is genetically modified. Almost all papayas in the entire world are genetically modified because of the papaya ring spot virus. So they all have a small gene that helps them be resistant to ring spot virus. The only other one I know about is the Arctic apple, which is, I think it's actually approved by the USDA. It could be sold. But the idea behind that is they put a gene from cod or some sort of like northern Pacific fish, cod or salmon, into the apple so that it can tolerate freezing a lot better and so that it can be transported more easily. But that's the only like direct to consumer fruit that I know of that's genetically modified.
It seems that plant sex has led to extraordinary diversity because of various kinds of pollination. Where does the role of polyembryonic seeds come in?
Like in?
As in citrus and mango?
Oh, yeah. The like the sort of clonal, like it makes a seed, but it's really a clone of the parent plant.
That do not result from cross-pollination or any pollination.
Yeah.
And then is that an evolutionary dead end?
It's hard to say if it's a dead end. It's certainly not a great path to go down because you're making clones. And so clones are really useful if you're in a new environment and you want to spread quickly, but they're not a smart idea if there's ever a problem. So in the case of citrus, it's because there are cells and tissues sort of around the ovule and the seed that can easily get incorporated into the seed. I think by mistake. I don't think the citrus is necessarily planning on that. But it ends up resulting in a seed that is essentially a clone of the parent plant. I think that in citrus's case, it's worked out pretty well. But I don't think, generally being clonal is not a great strategy in the long term for plants. Certainly bamboo is an example of one where you get a lot of clones and you get big bamboo forests, but like they don't tend to make seeds that often, and it causes a lot of problems later on, especially if there are diseases. So evolutionarily, it's not great.
We got many years ago this apple tree from Home Depot. They came with the label that said Fiji, not Fuji, Fiji. It's tropical apple. We brought a box of the smallest one because we thought there's many people today. And it's been producing easily, and we really didn't know much about what to do, how to help. And besides making a lot of horizontal branches and trying to keep it short, and it's been a very, very good apple tree. This year it's been sprouting from all over the yard. Now, is it sprouting from the roots? Is it sprouting like the seeds of the apple? Why is it coming all of a sudden all over the places of the yard? And can it become a future tree that bears fruit being coming from somewhere from the yard?
I think it probably could become a future tree. I mean, if it's making any kind of shoot, ideally it would turn into a tree. If it's coming from seeds though, in the case of apple can't pollinate itself. It can pollinate itself, but it's not going to make any sort of clones. So the seeds that are going to fall on the ground and make new plants, they're going to be very different from the parent.
But would they bear fruit?
Probably, unless the plant was some sort of very strange hybrid. But in that case, I would imagine they would bear fruit, because otherwise you wouldn't really get any seeds on the ground.
What if it comes from the roots so that they're walking around the yard?
So if it's like a sucker from like a root that's far away.
But very far from the tree.
That is odd. Apples wouldn't, they're not like bamboo or anything like that. So they shouldn't do that. I would imagine that it's like some sort of seed that was moved and starting its own plant. But if it is a sucker from the roots, it should be able to form its own tree on some level.
So if it becomes a tree, where we put it in another place, we can just trim it and prune it and treat it like a tree?
Yeah, or I mean, if you want to propagate that one, you can probably take cuttings of the parent plant to be certain, but if it is a sucker from the roots, yeah.
Yeah, the other little question was about fig. You haven't mentioned fig that are here. Are they like the group that they make the seeds on the inside? And
yeah, so a fig fruit is sort of complicated. It is, some botanists would call it its own category. But usually you would think of it as like a sort of a multiple fruit, like a mulberry. But evolutionarily, imagine a sunflower, for instance, that has this enormous flower with a bunch of fruits in the center. Imagine a sunflower that sort of like cinches up like a purse at the top. And that's basically what a fig is. And then of course, it's not sunflower seeds on the inside, it's fig seeds. But that's sort of the idea behind what a fig fruit is. It's a bunch of flowers, and the flowers are never exposed, they're always hidden. And in the wild, there's a little wasp that goes in and pollinates it, which is really fascinating. Whole great story. But yeah, so that one's an example of a multiple fruit, because there's a bunch of flowers on the inside, they're making their own fruit, and then it sort of forms one clump that we eat as a fruit.
thank you.
There's some questions online regarding figs that Khaled had. So what is the advantage or purpose of having something like a fig breba crop where a node can generate first year fruit? He said that main crop tastes great, and a breba on the second year wood or nodes. So the question, like summing it down, is what's the advantage or purpose of having like these crops that like pop up kind of early season and later season?
So there is in plants a lot of pressure to sort of like time when you're going to make flowers and fruits. So in one case, the earlier in the season that you can make a fruit, the easier it is for you to get that fruit eaten by other animals, get those things spread around. Often you can get a jump on a life cycle. You can take advantage of pollinators being out early, but it's also kind of a danger, because imagine that you're the first apple to flower and you flower in like January. Well, there's no bees around. in January. So there's a lot of different pressures to keep flowers either synchronized with each other across an environment so that they can pollinate each other and have no inbreeding. But also they want to be the first so that they get all the animals eating their fruits, or all the pollinators for themselves. So there's a lot of math and strategy behind it. So different plants do different things. In the case of some plants that have like alternate bearing, where it's like a heavy crop and a light crop, sometimes that's just some strange environmental signal, or they didn't have enough resources to have like a lot of fruits in one year versus one other year.
Cool. Okay, other question. There was one other detail on that same one. There was a note that on the same thing that the breba fruit probably isn't pollinated and so doesn't have viable seeds, and usually doesn't taste as great as a main crop, or otherwise has less desirable characteristics. I don't know if that was.
Yeah, so it is possible to make a fruit without pollination. So some plants they need it's possible to make a fruit without fertilization. You can have like some sort of pollen that grows in the fruit, or it grows in the flower, and then can induce the ovary to swell up and kind of make something that looks like a fruit, but probably doesn't taste great, definitely has no seeds. But it's mostly like a swollen, sugary thing on the plant rather than like a fruit per se.
Back to the apple. They asked me this question and I don't have an answer. So why are those apples waxy? I mean, we are totally organic, don't put anything, but after some heat, those apples, if you touch them, they feel like they have wax on it. Is there a way to protect them from losing moisture? Because they feel waxy. And
do you mean the ones you buy in the store, or the ones that come
no,
off
the one we have from a tree? I mean, you can touch it, you can feel it.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like it's got wax on it. And the people ask with suspicion, and we don't do anything on it.
Yeah, so plants make their own waxes naturally, and plants really fight a battle with like keeping their own water or losing water. Like water is incredibly important for plants. And so wax, because it's waterproof, coats the outside of the fruit, and an apple fruit specifically has a lot of water compared to most other parts of the plant. And so if it's hot, the water is going to get lost from the wateriest part. And so the plant makes a layer of wax, it's called a cuticle, on the outside to protect as much as it can from water loss. And so how thick that cuticle is sort of depends on the plant and the season and stuff like that.
Better than artificial intelligence.
And back to the figs. These figs, I'm thinking about the ones that do not have the holes for the wasp to go up into. So are those figs actually pollinated? Do they pollinate themselves inside?
Yeah,
and
they're usually self-pollinated. Yeah.
And the flesh that we eat, that's not really the ovule of the fruit, is it? Isn't that like some protective covering or something that develops?
Once you're like inside the fig, the sort of red part, that's generally actual fruit tissue. The green and sort of like latexy part on the outside, that's similar to like the red part of the strawberry, or like the majority of an apple. That's some sort of other flower tissue. You can also think of it as like when you have an acorn, the like little cap on an acorn, not really part of the fruit technically, but like sort of wraps around the fruit, like an old remnant of the flower. So that sort of similar thing.
I was just going to point out that there was another question in the chat was about the books you brought. Do you have those around so our Zoom audience can see what you brought? I think people just want to know what they are. Maybe you can show them to the camera so they can they'll show up on the video as well.
Probably the best one. So I brought 4. Probably the best one, especially for this group, is one called Plant Propagation by Hartman and Kessler. It's really phenomenal, talks about, it's full color. It has a lot of information about tissue culture, about grafting, how hormones work on plants. It's really a fascinating book. I'm happy to like leave it here so you guys can look through it. I need it back, of course, but so that's a really great one that I stole from my master's advisor when she was retiring. So it says Hazel Wetstein on it. There is also this, so I taught a botany lab for a while. And there is this lab manual that has a lot of drawings of, early on it's mosses and things like that. But eventually you get to still mosses. Mosses are very important. Eventually you get to like pine trees and how they're structured. And then towards the end, diagrams of vascular tissue, leaf modifications. It's really like a fun tour through all kinds of different parts of plant biology.
Can you show the cover to the camera?
A photographic atlas for the botany laboratory. This is the 3rd edition. They're probably on like the 9th edition by now, so it's dirt cheap online. I do not know anything about dragon fruits.
Okay, that was a question about dragon fruits, but he couldn't help with that one.
And then if you're into like very, very in-depth like anatomy, Catherine Esau has Anatomy of Seed Plants. That one's more of a scientific text. So it has, this one's very old, mostly like cross sections of like cellular biology, that kind of stuff. And then I have like an intro botany textbook that has some fun stuff, but it's not anything of note.
Oh, great, thank you.
Oh,
another apple question, maybe?
The apple?
Being in a time of a drought,
Mhm.
which one do you advise as a fruit tree to consider versus one that is a water hog?
Oh man, well, not almonds.
I mean, I know almonds have a bad reputation. Is that true that they take a lot of water? I mean, I'm not going to plant an almond, but what?
Yeah, I mean, I've never grown them or seen any studies on it. I know that things like pomegranates are pretty good. They can deal with like a lot of not great water. Yeah, I think avocados maybe depending on the variety, but honestly, you all would probably know better than I would.
Hmm.
Of course, anytime.
All right, Alex, thank you so much. That was great.